Vexx, a game aptly titled after how I was feeling while I was attempting to play this thing. But to no one's surprise, it's also made by Acclaim, which is a good sign right off the bat. The story follows a nondescript natural disaster that blew up your home planet. Now it's a series of free-floating rock formations in the middle of space. And now there's an evil army led by some evil guy who enslaved your entire race. Now you smolder with generic rage and try to kill him, only to end up stealing a pair of weapons destined to destroy him. You are then abruptly knocked out and rescued by some old guy who tells you to trust no one, as appearances can be deceiving, thus 100% confirming he is in fact the villain of the game in disguise. Alright, so at this point you will be seeing footage of exactly one area. And there's a reason for that. This is a 3D platforming collectathon, not unlike Mario 64 or Banjo-Kazooie, except those games are much better. So here's the deal. You run around collecting the severed hearts of your opponents. They're the main collectible of the game, similar to Super Mario Stars or Banjo-Kazooie's jigsaw pieces. And they're beating hearts because they wanted to make it a darker Mario 64, I guess. But all this footage is of 1 hour of me playing, substantially less than I normally record, and I'll freely admit that. But the deal is, this was 1 hour's worth of attempts to get the first main collectible. 1 hour to attempt to get the first step on the journey underway. The reason I don't have footage further than that is because after that 1 hour, I gave up. Why? Because trying to get even this first collectible was just so much of a chore, having to fight against the controls, the camera, the physics, the collision detection. It just wasn't worthwhile. And yes, while this is normally against my policy of not reviewing a game I haven't finished, I think the fact that I've spent an hour in this game and have gotten fed up with not making any progress simply because this game controls so poorly is sign enough I can say not to buy it. But here's the deal. You run around, you collect things. That's pretty basic for a 3D platforming collectathon, right? But let's start with the actual platforming and just go from there in the many ways this goes wrong. So, running and jumping. Pretty normal, pretty average, what you'd find in any sort of platforming game, right? Well, this game decides to do the Super Mario 64 thing, where you've got a long jump and a high jump that are assigned to the exact same button combination. Except one requires you hold it slightly longer and have some forward momentum to cause it. You know, that works generally well. I mean, Mario 64 proved it. Except in this game, your long jump doesn't seem to act within the same realm of physics as the rest of the game. Super Mario 64's long jump acted on the same principles that the in-game physics engine did. However, the in-game jumping here seems to be completely scripted based on you're supposed to be at point A, end up at point B, and you just sort of teleport there with an animation of it. However, the collision with this is a little bit wonky. First and foremost, if you collide anywhere near a wall, you're basically screwed. See, if you land near a wall in a jump, you will slide down a wall, similar to Mario 64. However, if you do a long jump, for whatever reason you seem to be stuck to the wall and then just sort of jump off completely beyond your control and have no control in your descent. And this generally means you'll collide with the ground or a pit or an enemy, and it's horrendously bad. The second biggest problem with this long high jump combination is the controls are way too touchy. I've had times where I was standing completely still and wanted to high jump, only to hop up like a normal jump, then long jump, for whatever reason. I've also had moments where I've tried to long jump, only to high jump, then long jump, which threw off the timing of the platforming entirely and kind of sent me to my death. For whatever reason, every time you want to jump, it seems like it almost takes two inputs, without your consent, meaning that your character's jumping ability is kind of entirely beyond your control. That is kind of awful, for obvious reasons. So jumping is kind of screwed, which is a problem in platforming. The second biggest problem is the camera. The camera seems to take a sort of director's choice camera angle. Now, you can control it with the C stick, which is good, except your camera frequently gets caught up on objects in the environment, which is awful. And more importantly, despite the fact that you have control over it, it still seems to take priority with the director's choice camera angle. But it still applies it to your modified camera angle. Let's put it this way. If the game had it set up so that you were supposed to be looking 90 degrees right on your character, so you're facing their left side, and then the camera was to, say, swing around 90 degrees clockwise so that you're facing your character, but you decide you want to put it directly behind your character so you can see where you're jumping, a logical conclusion seeing as it's a platformer and that's kind of an important thing, well then suddenly the camera is now facing your direct side for reasons. Also, it tends to do this while you're moving, thus completely screwing your control over your character as well, because it also seems to take a moment to register that the camera has changed, so you'll continue moving in the specific direction as dictated by the camera based on your control inputs. That's horrendously bad. That's not all though. Some objects don't seem to have proper texturing or shading. Now that seems like a minor gripe, but combined with the wonky camera, it's really hard to judge depth in this game. Like, in this one area that I've been trying to climb up for however long this review's been going at this point, there's a pole you're supposed to jump on and climb up. This pole has no texture. It's really stupidly hard to figure out how far you have to jump in order to make it. Like, you can make it every time, there's no question about it, but trying to calculate that jump in your head just doesn't make sense relative to where you are, simply because there's really no depth as to where it is relative to you. And not being able to judge depth in a platformer is sort of breaking a cardinal rule of making proper platformers, because in order to make a proper platformer, you have to be able to always know where you're supposed to jump and how far your character can make those jumps. Here it's sort of just not there, which is atrocious. But let's get off platforming and talk about combat, because it's here, sorta. You basically just mash the button until all the enemies stop moving, which you'd think is easy enough, except enemies like to try and gang up on you. Now this isn't normally a problem in a lot of games because you can at least figure out what enemy you need to attack and go from there. This game, however, your character seems to dictate what enemy it wants to attack rather than you. So essentially you just sort of button mash and hope your character attacks the enemies attacking him and not the ones kind of just wandering around nearby, or else you die. Near as I can tell, there is also no evasive or defensive abilities either, so you're basically kind of screwed. So yeah, platforming's naff, as is combat. Oh, and it takes a cue from Banjo-Kazooie. That one thing from the original Banjo-Kazooie that no one liked. If you die, your minor collectibles that turn into one major collectible, yeah, they all reset. So basically, if you intend to collect all the little things to make one of the bigger thing, you gotta play perfectly. Which isn't normally a problem if the camera wasn't completely against you in attempting to platform properly, thus sending you to your death, thus resetting all your collectibles, thus sending you back to the start. Bravo! Okay, I'm not gonna lie, I haven't played this game all the way through. I think we've established this at this point, so I can't give you a full rundown of how this game looks or sounds. I did play this once when I was a kid, and I managed to get about halfway through, and I thought that the environments were kinda interesting conceptually, but pretty bland. And all the voice acting I've heard thus far has not impressed me in the least. They're fairly low budget voice actors, it sounds like. So, yeah, uninformed, but not great looking, or sounding in any way, shape, or form. The story is bland, the controls and overall gameplay are pretty awful. The world itself seems kinda interesting, if a little drab. And I do remember that you do unlock new abilities and forms and stuff, which does add a little bit of replayability and is somewhat creative. But would I recommend Vexx? Well, if you can get past the overly sensitive controls, completely random roll of the dice combat, and difficulty platforming, oh, and one of the most god-awful 3D platformer cameras ever. I mean, seriously, it took them a while, but they had this shit down on the N64. Why is it so bad on the GameCube and PS2 and Xbox? Such a bad camera. Look, the point is, if you can get past all of those things, you have a hell of a lot more patience than I do. And you can overlook a lot that actually would make a game functional, which, well, good for you. It won't cost you much, but if you have trouble with games that aren't particularly well controlling or have awful cameras, or are basically fighting you every single goddamn step of the way so that you can actually attempt to finish a game, skip this one, because it's just going to enrage you. But it's also a game made by Acclaim. I mean, have they ever made anything remotely good? Or even competent? Serious question.